In 1987, former Luftwaffe jet pilot Franz Stigler sat in a hotel room in Seattle speaking to an audience of American aviation enthusiasts. Many in the room had fought against Germany. Some had been shot at by Me-262 jets. Stigler paused, looked at his former enemies, and said something that silenced the room. The Me-262 could have changed the outcome of the air war. We had the technology to stop your bombing campaign, but we got it 2 years too late, and when we did get it, we used it wrong. Let me tell you why. We lost the war we could have won. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, entering combat in July 1944. It was 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters. It carried 4 30mm cannons that could destroy a B-17 with a single burst. German pilots who flew it described feeling like they had traveled into the future. Allied pilots who encountered it reported shock and helplessness, yet Germany built only 1,400 Me-262s and lost the war less than a year after the jet entered service. This is the story from the German perspective, not of what was, but what could have been. The Me-262 was not given to average pilots. It required the Luftwaffe's best men who had survived years of combat and possessed exceptional skill. These were pilots who had already shot down dozens, sometimes hundreds of Allied aircraft in propeller-driven fighters. Now they were being asked to master an entirely new form of aviation. Adolf Galland, general of fighters and himself an ace with 104 victories, was among the first to fly the Me-262. His test flight on May 22, 1943, changed his entire perspective on aerial warfare. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "It was as if angels were pushing. The acceleration was smooth and powerful, unlike the violent jerking of our best piston engines. I knew immediately that this aircraft could restore our air superiority, but I also knew our leadership would find a way to squander this advantage." Franz Stigler, who would survive the war with 28 victories, transitioned to jets in November 1944. 40 years later, he recalled his first flight. The Me-109 felt like riding a horse. The Me-262 felt like riding a rocket. Everything happened faster. Takeoff, climb, combat, landing. Your mind had to work at a different speed. Many experienced pilots couldn't make the transition. They thought in propeller speeds and died in jet speeds. The selection process was brutal. Pilots needed at least 500 combat hours and 50 victories to even be considered. Even then, many washed out during training. The Me-262 was unforgiving. Its engines were temperamental. It needed long runways. It was vulnerable during takeoff and landing. It required a completely different combat philosophy. Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded jet fighter units and scored 176 victories total, described the psychological adjustment. In a Bf-109, you could turn with enemy fighters, dance with them. In the Me-262, you were a hawk diving through pigeons. One pass, strike, climb away. If you tried to dogfight, you died. The aircraft's advantage was speed, not maneuverability. Many pilots died learning this lesson. The pilots chosen for jet units understood they were Germany's last hope. By late 1944, Allied bombers were devastating German cities daily. Fighter production was moving underground. Fuel was critically short. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. The Me-262 represented the only technical advantage Germany still possessed. Walter Krupinski, who flew both the Me-262 and conventional fighters, reflected after the war, "We knew we were flying the future. When I shot down my first Mustang in the jet, it was almost unfair. He never saw me coming. I was on him and gone before he could react. But we also knew it was too late. We had hundreds of jets. The Americans had thousands of Mustangs. You cannot win a war with technical superiority alone when you're outnumbered 50 to 1. The Me-262 entered combat on July 25, 1944, when test pilot Alfred Schreiber attacked a British Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft. The Mosquito, one of the fastest Allied aircraft, simply couldn't escape. Schreiber closed from behind at a speed differential the British pilot couldn't comprehend. The Mosquito was destroyed in seconds. Word spread quickly through Allied fighter units. Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, encountered an Me-262 in November 1944. He described it decades later. "I was flying my P-51 named Glamorous Glenn. I saw this thing coming at me. No propeller, just two engines under the wings. It went by me like I was standing still. I managed to damage one during landing when it was slow and vulnerable, but in straight combat, we couldn't touch them. It was like trying to catch a rifle bullet with a baseball." German pilots quickly developed tactics to maximize the jet's advantages. Georg Peter Eder, who flew Me-262s against American bomber formations, explained in a 1980s interview, "We would climb to 30,000 feet above the bomber stream. Then we'd dive through the formation at 600 miles per hour, firing at one bomber, maybe two if we were lucky, and zoom climb away before the escorts could react. By the time the Mustangs turned to engage, we were already 2 miles away and climbing." The psychological impact on Allied aircrews was profound. Bombardier John Holmes of the 447th Bomb Group recalled, "We'd been told about German jets, but seeing one was different. It came out of nowhere, moving impossibly fast. Our gunners couldn't track it. The fighters couldn't catch it. 3 B-17s went down in maybe 10 seconds. We felt helpless, like we were flying World War I planes against something from Buck Rogers." However, German pilots also discovered the Me-262's limitations. Franz Stigler recalled, "The engines were delicate. We had to advance the throttles slowly or risk flameout. We needed concrete runways at least 2,000 meters long. We consumed fuel at an enormous rate. A typical mission lasted 40 minutes, and if an engine failed during takeoff, you were dead. The aircraft couldn't maintain flight on one engine at low speed." The Me-262's development began in 1938, but its potential as a fighter was not recognized by German leadership until too late. The story of this delay is one of the war's great what-ifs, told most bitterly by the German pilots who knew what could have been. Adolf Galland fought for 2 years to get the Me-262 produced as a fighter. In his post-war testimony at Nuremberg and later interviews, he revealed the frustration. "I flew the prototype in May 1943. I immediately reported to Goering and Hitler that this aircraft could sweep Allied fighters from the sky. Hitler asked one question: can it carry bombs? When told it could carry 500 kilograms, he decreed it would be a bomber, not a fighter. This single decision may have cost us the war. Hitler's obsession with retaliation bombing overrode military logic. He wanted to strike back at Britain for bombing German cities. He called the Me-262 his Blitz bomber. He explicitly forbade its development as a fighter, threatening court-martial for anyone who disobeyed. Galland later wrote, "We had the world's most advanced fighter, and Hitler wanted to hang bombs on it. It was like using a racing car to pull a plow." The Me-262's advantage was its speed and climb rate. Adding bombs reduced both. As a bomber, it was mediocre. As a fighter, it was revolutionary. But Hitler wouldn't listen to pilots. He listened to his own fantasies of revenge. Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded Jagdverband 44, the elite Me-262 unit, was more blunt in his assessment. Hitler's bomber decision delayed the Me-262 fighter program by at least 8 months. Those 8 months, from November 1943 to July 1944, were when the 8th Air Force achieved air superiority over Germany. If we had 300 Me-262 fighters operational in January 1944 instead of July, the daylight bombing campaign might have been stopped. The few Me-262s configured as bombers proved Galland right. They were too fast for accurate bombing and too vulnerable when carrying external ordnance. German pilots forced to fly bombing missions in jets described it as criminal misuse of the aircraft. One pilot, who requested anonymity even 40 years later, said, "We dive toward the target at 500 miles per hour, release our bombs with no accuracy whatsoever, and run for home. It was pointless." Meanwhile, B-17s were destroying our cities, and we had the weapon to stop them sitting on airfields with bombs attached. The Me-262 specifications were revolutionary for 1944. Its maximum speed of 540 miles per hour was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. It could climb to 30,000 feet in 7 minutes, compared to 13 minutes for the Mustang. Its 4 Mk108 30mm cannons could destroy any Allied aircraft with a short burst. Hans Fay, a Messerschmitt engineer who worked on the project, explained in a 1991 interview, "The swept wing design was accidental genius. We swept the wings to correct center of gravity issues, not for aerodynamic reasons, but the sweep delayed the onset of compressibility, allowing higher speeds. We discovered by accident what took Americans years of research to understand. The Jumo 004 engines were problematic. They lasted only 25 hours between overhauls, but they worked. We were 5 years ahead of the Allies in jet technology." German pilots who flew both the Me-262 and captured Allied fighters could make direct comparisons. Rudolf Sinner, who tested captured aircraft at Rechlin, stated in his memoirs, "I flew captured P-51s, Spitfires, and P-47s. All were excellent aircraft." But the Me-262 was from a different era. It was like comparing a rifle to a bow and arrow. The speed differential alone made conventional combat tactics obsolete. The armament was particularly devastating. Wolfgang Schenk, who scored 18 victories in Me-262s, explained, 4 30mm cannons firing explosive shells. One hit could tear a fighter in half. 3 or 4 hits would destroy a B-17. The American 50 caliber machine guns needed dozens of hits to destroy a target. We needed 3 or 4. But we had only 65 rounds per gun, so accuracy was critical. However, the technical superiority came with serious drawbacks. The engines were unreliable, made from inferior materials due to shortages of rare metals. They were vulnerable to flameout if throttles were advanced too quickly. They consumed enormous amounts of fuel. The Me-262 carried 1,700 liters of J2 diesel fuel, enough for approximately 40 minutes of flight time. Franz Stigler summarized the paradox. We had the most advanced fighter in the world, built with substitute materials by slave labor in underground factories while being bombed daily. It was a thoroughbred racing horse with broken legs. The aircraft could have been unbeatable if we'd had proper materials, trained pilots, good runways, and fuel. But if we'd had those things, we wouldn't have needed miracle weapons to begin with. By the time the Me-262 entered combat in meaningful numbers in autumn 1944, Germany's strategic situation was hopeless. The Luftwaffe was operating from damaged airfields, with inexperienced pilots and chronic fuel shortages. The Me-262 units faced overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Galland, who formed the elite Jagdverband 44 unit, equipped entirely with Me-262s, described the reality. We had 44 jets operational on my best day. The Americans were sending 1,000 bombers and 800 fighters over Germany daily. Even if each Me-262 shot down 5 Allied aircraft per mission, which was impossible, we couldn't stop them. We were using a scalpel to stop a sledgehammer. The fuel situation was critical. Germany's synthetic fuel plants were primary bombing targets. By December 1944, jet fuel production had fallen to 10% of requirements. Walter Krupinski recalled, "We had jets that couldn't fly for lack of fuel. I remember standing on the airfield, watching hundreds of American bombers overhead with 6 Me-262s fueled and ready, but ordered not to take off because we needed to save fuel for more important missions. What could be more important than stopping the bombers destroying our fuel production?" Training was another critical failure. The Me-262 required experienced pilots, but most experienced pilots were dead by late 1944. New pilots were being sent to jet units with less than 100 hours total flight time. They couldn't handle the aircraft's speed and complexity. Heinrich Erler, who commanded jet units, testified after the war, "I received replacement pilots who had never flown anything faster than 200 miles per hour. The Me-262 landed at 120 miles per hour faster than their trainers flew at full throttle. We lost more pilots in landing accidents than in combat. It was murder to send these boys up in jets." The Allies quickly developed tactics to counter the Me-262. They would loiter near German jet bases, attacking the jets during takeoff and landing when they were slow and vulnerable. Chuck Yeager described the tactic. "We couldn't catch them in the air, so we caught them on the ground. We'd orbit their airfields at low altitude, waiting. When a jet took off, we'd dive on it before it could accelerate. When one came in to land, we'd hit it on approach." It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. In post-war interviews, German jet pilots consistently returned to the same question. What if the Me-262 had been deployed earlier and correctly? Their answers, given decades after the war with time for reflection, are surprisingly consistent and realistic. Adolf Galland, speaking in 1986, if we had 300 Me-262 fighters operational by January 1944, we could have inflicted prohibitive losses on the American daylight bombing campaign. Not stopped it entirely, but made it so costly that they might have switched to night bombing only. This would have reduced bombing accuracy by 70% and given our industries breathing room. However, Galland also acknowledged the limitations. But could we have won the war? No. The Soviets were advancing from the east with thousands of tanks. The Allies would have invaded France regardless. The atomic bomb was coming. At best, the Me-262 could have prolonged the war by 6 months to a year. The outcome was decided by industrial capacity and resources, not by one aircraft, no matter how advanced. Johannes Steinhoff offered a more technical analysis. The Me-262 needed infrastructure we didn't have by 1944. Long, concrete runways, high-grade fuel, trained mechanics, rare metals for engines. Even if Hitler had approved it as a fighter in 1942, we couldn't have produced more than 500 before our industries were disrupted. 500 jets against thousands of Allied fighters? We'd have lost anyway, just more slowly. Franz Stigler, who survived to become friends with former enemies, was philosophical. The Me-262 represented what Germany could have been: technologically advanced, innovative, leading the world in aviation. Instead, it became a symbol of our failure too late, misused, wasted by poor leadership. Even if we'd had 2,000 Me-262s in 1943, we were still led by madmen who would have found a way to lose. The American perspective, provided by pilots who faced the Me-262, largely agrees with German assessments. Robin Oz, who would later become an ace in Vietnam, encountered Me-262s in 1945. They scared the hell out of us. If the Germans had 500 of those things in early 44 with good pilots and fuel, our daylight bombing would have been in serious trouble. But they didn't have the pilots, the fuel, or the numbers. Thank God for that. Behind the technical discussions and strategic what-ifs were human beings flying these revolutionary aircraft in desperate circumstances. The German jet pilots knew they were flying for a lost cause, yet they continued. Their motivations, revealed in post-war interviews, were complex and deeply personal. Walter Schuck, who scored 8 victories in Me-262s, explained, "By December 1944, we knew the war was lost. We weren't flying for Hitler or the Nazi Party. We were flying to protect German cities, our families. Every bomber we shot down meant fewer German civilians killed. That's what kept us going up, even when we knew it was hopeless. The stress was enormous. Pilots were flying multiple missions daily, often against 100-to-1 odds. They watched friends die, saw their airfields bombed, knew their families were in danger. Many turned to alcohol, or stimulants to cope. Heinrich Eller, who would die in a Me-262 in April 1945, wrote his last letter to his wife. "I fly the most advanced fighter in the world, and I am powerless to protect you. Yesterday I shot down 2 bombers. Today those bombers' brothers destroyed the rail yard where your brother worked. Tomorrow I will shoot down more, and they will keep coming. We are killing each other for nothing now, but I must continue. Honor demands it, even when honor is all we have left." The ground crews who maintained the temperamental jets also paid a price. These were often teenage boys or elderly men, the only ones left by 1945. They worked in freezing conditions, under constant threat of strafing attacks, trying to keep complex jets operational with inadequate tools and spare parts. Kurt Meyer, a mechanic with JV-44, recalled, "We worked 18-hour days, trying to keep maybe 6 jets flyable. The engines needed complete overhaul after 25 hours. We had no spare engines. We'd cannibalize crashed aircraft, steal parts from other units, make substitutions that shouldn't have worked. Every time a pilot took off, we wondered if our repairs would hold. When they didn't come back, we wondered if it was enemy action or our failure." The Me-262's combat career ended with Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, of approximately 1,400 built. Fewer than 300 saw combat. They claimed approximately 735 Allied aircraft destroyed against 150 Me-262s lost in air combat, a 5-to-1 kill ratio that validated the aircraft's superiority but highlighted its numerical insignificance. After the war, captured Me-262s were extensively tested by Allied nations. American test pilot Eric Brown flew captured examples and reported, "It was at least 5 years ahead of anything we had. The swept wing, the axial flow turbojets, the heavy cannon armament, all revolutionary. We learned more from studying the Me-262 than from any other captured aircraft." The German pilots who flew the Me-262 had varied post-war fates. Galland became an aviation consultant and maintained friendships with former enemies. Steinhoff joined the new West German Luftwaffe and later NATO. Stigler emigrated to Canada and became close friends with Charlie Brown, an American B-17 pilot he had spared during the war. In their final years, these pilots reflected on their experience with remarkable consistency. They were proud of flying the world's first operational jet fighter, bitter about its misuse, realistic about its limitations, and haunted by the what-if question that could never be answered. Franz Stigler, in one of his last interviews before his death in 2008, summarized, "The Me-262 was the best fighter of World War II, but it fought in a war that was already lost. We flew into the future, but we were chained to a dying past. Could it have changed history? Perhaps, if deployed earlier. But history doesn't deal in perhaps. It deals in what was, not what might have been." The story of the Me-262, told from the German perspective, is ultimately not about technology, but about the failure to use technology effectively. It's about political interference destroying military effectiveness, about ideology overriding logic, about brilliant engineering wasted by poor leadership. Modern military analysts study the Me-262 as a cautionary tale. Having superior technology means nothing without the doctrine, training, logistics, and leadership to employ it effectively. The German jet pilots understood this truth as they flew their revolutionary aircraft in a lost cause. Wolfgang Schenk, one of the last surviving Me-262 pilots, offered this final assessment in 2015. People ask me if the Me-262 could have won the war. The wrong question. The right question is, why did we have the world's best fighter and still lose? The answer is simple. Wars are not won by single weapons, no matter how advanced. They are won by systems, industrial systems, logistical systems, political systems. We had a superior fighter. The Allies had superior everything else. The Me-262 remains one of history's great what-ifs, a glimpse of what might have been if deployed earlier, used correctly, and supported properly. But, as the German pilots who flew it understood, even then, it would have only delayed the inevitable. The war was decided not in the skies over Germany in 1945, but in the factories of America and the oil fields of Texas and the vast spaces of Russia. Their testimony, given decades after the war, provides the final verdict on the Me-262. A magnificent achievement that came too late, was used incorrectly, and ultimately proved that technical superiority alone cannot overcome strategic failure. It was the best fighter of World War II, fighting for the losing side in a war that was already decided.